Isabel Allende is a national and an international treasure. And it all began, of course, with the House of the Spirits in 1982, which has brought her to be one of the most widely read authors in the world and beloved in English, in Spanish, in so many countless languages. And it has led us 25 books later to her new transcendent memoir, The Soul of a Woman, about which she'll be speaking tonight. We are so blessed to have her here. She is a person whose life is just as beautiful and passionate and inspiring as her prose. Here she is, Isabel Allende with Jeff Brown. Thanks.
Gracias. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. I am very rusty. I have been out of order for a long time. Since the beginning of the pandemic, I haven't seen anybody. But I got a husband in the meantime. And I have been locked away in an eternal honeymoon with a Polish husband. Well, of Polish descent. And writing, the only thing that I could do because there was nothing else to do. So years ago, everything seems like years ago, I gave a speech in Mexico City in a women's conference, and I don't have any idea what I said. But it went viral, and many people saw it, and it was streamed somehow. So my publishers in Spain decided to make a little booklet with the speech. So I read the speech, and it was totally dated, stale, because so many things had happened in a few months. The Me Too movement, women protesting in the streets everywhere, the Black Lives Matter. There was a sort of young energy out there that was not in my speech. So I said, no, this can't be published at all. But then I started thinking about my own life, my trajectory as a woman and as a feminist. And the book begins, so I ended up writing this little book, which is very easy to read, and it's cheap. So it's not that I'm recommending it, because everything that it contains, we will talk about it, so you don't have to buy it. As my granddaughter says, wait for the movie. So this book begins with a sentence that many people have said is an exaggeration. I say that I was a feminist since kindergarten. I was born in 1942. That means that next year I will be 80. I look good for my age, you have to admit. Yeah. Takes a lot of money. In 1942, in Chile, in a conservative, Catholic, patriarchal, Paleolithic family where I was born, and in a very socially conservative Catholic society, I don't think anybody had heard the word feminism. It was not in the narrative, let's say, let alone in my family. So why did I rebel against male authority since I was a little kid? I think that it all started with my mother. My mother was a gorgeous woman who married the wrong man against their parents' wish. That was my father. And so they were married for 3 years, and she had 3 kids. The fertility runs in the family, thank God. In my case, the pill was invented. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I would be raising grandchildren. My mother was abandoned by my father with 2 toddlers in diapers and a newborn baby that my father didn't meet because he left before the baby was born. And my brother Juan was born at home with my very distressed young mother, who eventually, very fast, had to return to Chile. All this happened in Lima, Peru. She had to return to Chile, where she had to live with her parents. So I grew up in my grandfather's house, where my bachelor uncles also lived. It was a male house because my grandmother died prematurely. And my mother was a charity case. She had a roof over her head. My grandfather paid for schooling and that kind of stuff, so we did not go hungry. But there was no cash. My mother couldn't buy us an ice cream. She was totally dependent. She was also a single woman with 3 kids in a society where people of that class did not separate or divorce. There was no divorce in Chile until 2004. It was the last country in the world to get divorce. So my mother was stuck and dependent, completely dependent, economically, emotionally, in every way. The only way that my mother could get any attention was by being sick. So she was sick all the time. And I grew up in this somber household of my grandfather, in the school of rigor, that you perform, you comply, you don't whine, you just do what you have to do, discipline, which was fine for me, but not for my mom. And I saw my mother as a victim of this structure that, of course, I couldn't name. It was just that I felt that it was very unfair. I saw as unfair the situation of my mom and the maids that worked in the house. At the time, people had 2, 3 maids living in the house. In Chile, of course, that has changed. That's not the case anymore. And these women were mostly illiterate, very poor. They had very little free time, worked like slaves, and they had no voice, no presence. They were invisible, like my mother in a certain way was. So I developed this rage that I couldn't name. My mother thought that I had tapeworm, or I was colicky or something. So I was taken to doctors to see what was wrong with me, because with that character, I would never lure a husband. I was 5. So they had to worry about my future. That did not diminish when I was growing up. It grew. And when I was in my puberty and 2 little plums appeared here, I realized that I was really screwed. I was not going to have the kind of life that my brothers would have. I couldn't be like them, but I would try to have what they had. And so then the struggle to get all that started very young. And I couldn't name it. It was just random rage about everything. Everything made me angry. Until late in my life, in my early 20s, I found out that I was not a lunatic, that there was a movement out there called the women's movement, and that there were millions of other women thinking like me, and they were writing books, and they had an articulate language to express all this that I felt. I started working as a journalist in a feminist magazine, and that gave me a platform to explore, to learn, to research, and to talk about all the issues that in Chile were taboo. Nobody talked about. Things that concern women always: domestic violence, drugs, motherhood, virginity, all the things that were never talked about. It was not part of the discussion ever. Of course, my grandfather was very distressed, but he put up with it. And I did lure a husband, actually. The poor guy was distracted, and I just caught him and married him before someone else would catch him, because getting married was very important at the time. I had 2 kids, worked as a journalist, as I said, and I was a very happy feminist doing a lot of work when the military coup happened in Chile, September 11th, 1973. And there is nothing more male chauvinistic than the military, a military coup especially. So all my life then took a turn, and I ended up living in exile and writing my first novel, The House of the Spirits, in exile in Venezuela. Then, later on, I came on a book tour to the United States, and I was passing by Northern California, and I was introduced to the last heterosexual bachelor in San Francisco. And somehow I fell in lust with the guy. So I moved to his house without an invitation, with the idea that in a week I would take him out of my mind. I ended up marrying him. We remained married for 28 years. Of course, the last part evaporated pretty fast. And then the rest remained, which was a lot of problems. So when I was 72, I divorced Willie and decided that my life would change completely. I would be alone and with my dog in a very little house, a very happy life. And that is what it was for like 2 months, I think, around 2 months. And then again, life took over. And that is what always happens. In my life, the big issues, the things that really have turned the direction of my life have been completely out of my control. And so I have learned to navigate whatever comes. The abandonment of my father, my mother's dependency, the military coup, exile, all those things happened in spite of me. And by there were not many options, just surrendering to it, I have been able to navigate for all these years. So this is what the book is about. It's about me as a woman and what the struggle for feminism has been. And often the journalists have asked me recently, what do you want with this book? What's your purpose? And I hadn't thought about it because I write fiction. And when you write fiction, you just want to tell a story. And there's no purpose to it. And if possible, you try to avoid giving a message, because if you give a message in fiction, it ruins the book. So I hadn't thought about it. But then I started thinking, if the book can be if it can start a conversation, then I'll be really happy with the result. A conversation between mothers and daughters, between a couple, an older couple, a young couple, between brothers and sisters, between mothers and sons. I think that we need to bring to the table a lot of issues that are in this book that they're so obvious that we don't see them. And when we start talking about things, things begin to change. So that's the whole purpose of the book. And now, the gentleman here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Rarely have I felt less necessary, as you can see. I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be back sitting here with all of you with this site. I've missed it a great deal, so thank you for having me back. I also want to, I was thinking about this, I'll tell you that this morning my wife and I were in our room and we were doing probably what a lot of you were doing, is looking at this, thinking about which sessions are we going to go to today, and it's a tough struggle. And my wife started laughing and she said, "Did you see how they described your talk with Isabel?" And she starts reading it, and she says, "In a wide-ranging conversation with the PBS NewsHour's Jeffrey Brown, Allende will talk about the soul of a woman, about her work, her marriages, and about how to live a passionate life." Slight pause, and then I think my wife, I want to hear it in a loving way, said, "Honey, that doesn't sound like you." But you get me, and I know why, because we've known each other a long time, and we've had these conversations professionally and then as friends over a number of years. And so it's a pleasure to get to talk to you again. So start off, though, with this, where you started, with the pandemic, because I just wonder how it impacted you. You write in this new book, as you're talking about where you're at in life now, "I am no longer tormented by an excess of discipline as I was before." Now, I know you, and I'm not sure I believe you.
Well, right now it's not discipline, it's tedium. What else can I do but write? I shouldn't be saying this because I'm recently married. My current husband, I say current because I have had several, And if I live to be 90, I might have another one. Sorry, Roger. We are stuck in a small house with 2 dogs, and he works, and I work at home in the attic, and there's nothing else. We have no social life. We don't travel anywhere. We don't even see much of a family because, first of all, the grandchildren don't take care of themselves, so they will bring the virus, and I don't like them that much anyhow. And so writing was the only thing that I could do. So it was more than, not just discipline, there was nothing else to do.
But you are a disciplined writer.
Yeah, I start all my books on January 8th. That means that by January 7th, I have to be ready. And that helps me a lot because otherwise I will be procrastinating forever. It's very hard to make the commitment to write a book.
This is something I've never heard from another writer. I start every book on January 8th.
Well, maybe January 6th. You have heard that?
I've heard. Yeah. So not as disciplined, but still very focused on wanting to tell stories and write.
Once I get into the mood of writing, I get so focused that I become demented to the point that my family worries that I'm losing it. And I don't know, because we just got out of the pandemic, and I think that many people like myself are feeling that we are not capable anymore of multitasking. We lost the muscle. We have to get it back. But for 15 months, we didn't have it. So now that I am in the world again, I don't know how to handle it.
Now, in the story you're telling in this book, and you were just telling an outline to all of us, you used the word rage. It's an important word for you. When did you realize that you could channel that rage into something positive?
Oh, very late. When I was 25 or 26, I started working in a feminist magazine in Chile, the first of its kind. And we were 4 young women, all of us under 30 years old, who really shook the society by bringing the feminist narrative into the conversation that had never been there before. And to do that, we read authors from other countries, we talked about ourselves, we researched, we really watched the society and got really into it. And just the fact that we could publish all this and research and tell what was going on was a way of channeling this rage. And then I discovered something really interesting, that everything can be said with a sense of humor. So I had a column in the magazine called Civilize Your Troglodyte. And the idea was to really make fun of the male chauvinist pig that was all around us. They were all over. And actually, today, that would be so politically incorrect that I would be in jail. But then, it was supposed to be funny. And many men were my fans, and they said, I have a friend who's just like the pig you describe. Was always a friend.
You should describe this atmosphere that you grew up in Chile, because it's, just to say it's male-dominated or centered is an understatement. What were the expectations for you as a young girl? Well,
this was a very long time ago. I don't want you to think that Chile is that way now, because the feminist movements in Chile have existed always. They have become very strong. Now in Chile, they are going to draft a new constitution to think of the future. What kind of country do we want? And in this constitution, 50% of the people who are drafting it are women. And the idea is that everybody will be included, and the management of the country will be done by half men and half women. And this is really extraordinary, because I've been saying for a long time that we need to end the patriarchy. And we must replace the patriarchy by a management of the world in which men and women in equal numbers and with equal power make the decisions, and in which feminine and masculine values have the same stand in the society. So this is beginning to happen in Chile. It's a wonderful experiment. But when I was born so many years ago, especially in my social class, the expectations for a woman like my mother, and like me, was that we would be educated, cultivated, if possible, refined, have good manners, etc., be excellent mothers and good wives, and we could have a job to help our husbands because starting in life was so hard and so forth, but never compete with the husband or compete with the males. Mm-hmm. So we would become secretaries or nurses, very seldom doctors or CEOs. My generation made the change, and so we were the ones who got out there, many of us dressed like men with ties and briefcases, to challenge this masculine world. Actually, many years ago, in 1995, here in the United States, I wrote a book about the gold rush called Daughter of Fortune. And Daughter of Fortune is the story of a young woman in Victorian times who comes to the gold rush looking for her lover. She wouldn't come for the gold or the glory. She comes for love. And the gold rush in California was a testosterone event in which young male from all over the world came to look for gold. And the people who came were losers, bandits, preachers, people who were running away from justice or running away from a wife or whatever. And very few women came at the beginning. And she comes, she's not a prostitute, she doesn't work as a prostitute, and she dresses like a man and has to work in that environment as a man and fend for herself. And then much later, when she acquires enough freedom and self-confidence, she can go back to a dress, but never again in a corset. And in a way, that's like an allegory of what happened to my generation, mm-hmm. that we went out there to a very masculine world, and we took it by assault. And it took many years before there was a critical number of women working, mm-hmm. so that they could be like women.
I mean, even if we fast forward a few years to what we all came to know as the Latin boom of writers, where many of us in North America were suddenly reading what became world-famous writers, they were all men.
All men.
And that was a very male affair. Did it feel like there was no room for women in that?
Women had been writing in Latin America since Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in the 17th century. But the women's voices were silenced or ignored. They were never reviewed, taught in universities. They were published in little editions, never well distributed. Literature was male, to the point that I loved telling stories, but I would have never thought of myself as a writer. It would have been, there were no role models. The role models were a few British spinsters that had committed suicide. Mm-hmm. So Latin America was in that sense very male. When I wrote my first novel, it became a sudden success out of pure luck and timing. And then there was a feminine voice here, so I'm not included in the boom. I am post-boom.
You're post-boom.
Post-boom, being post whatever is not very nice.
But you're, I see the number 75 million books. That's a lot of books.
That was 2 years ago, so maybe.
Oh. So what are we at, 77?
No, I'm kidding.
No, but I mean, you became your own boom in a sense. I mean, how much did that world change after the House of the Spirits? Not only for you, but for other women.
It did change. Yeah. For me, my first book paved the way for the 25 other books that I have written. I have the same publishers everywhere, very loyal readers. And I never have to worry if a book is going to be published or not. But it also made publishers aware that there is a huge market out there. Women more than men buy fiction and read fiction. Mm-hmm. And there were so many extraordinary voices. So now there's what they call the boom of Latin American women writers, because there is a bunch of them, and they're all young, really young, writing these extraordinary books with such language and strength and experience. And I wish I could write like that.
Yeah. No, but I wanted you to say this because it's exciting, isn't it?
It's exciting, very exciting.
There's a whole new world of
Yeah,
writing.
in the United States, probably there's an equal number of fiction writers that are women or men. But that was not the case in Latin America before. And it is becoming.
You know, we're talking about, you talk about being a feminist from kindergarten. Literally about 15 minutes ago, just before we went on, a mutual friend of ours wrote and said, I hear you're talking to Isabel today. That's great. And she said, ask her about the Barbie doll. There was to be an Isabel Allende Barbie doll. So I just asked her about it, and now she's going to tell you the story she told me, because, I mean, think about this in the well, you tell it, in the context of feminism.
Well, what I can say is that I was called because they wanted to do a Barbie doll with my image. So I thought, this is the icon of anti-feminism. What is this? But it seems
But with good intention. I mean, the idea was more diversity for Barbie.
And the idea was to create a collection of role models that are not the typical Barbie. But Roger, my husband, said, oh, this is any man's dream to be married to a Barbie. I'm afraid it's not going to happen because it's very much a commercial gimmick, and I have to be very careful with that. So I'm thinking about it. But they have already made Barbies with Oprah, with Amanda Gorman, with astronauts, so it's interesting what they're trying to do.
Our mutual friend wrote and said, ask Isabel, what's that going to look like? I think she was tweaking you, right?
Yeah, well, I'm going to look with big breasts and long legs and tiny hands and tiny feet and a lot of hair.
You know, speaking of this mutual friend, a couple of years ago, my wife and I had the chance to travel with Isabel and Roger and these two friends to Chile. And I tell you this because I know a lot of writers, and I'm with people in, public spaces, but I've never in my life experienced anything like this, about what happened to walk down the street or go to a restaurant with Isabel in Chile. Never seen it. People just came up everywhere, not just recognition, not just hello, but in tears or to hug her. We would go to one memorable moment, we went to a restaurant, and first the waitresses came up to say, sort of, can I hug you, can I get a photograph? And then, amazingly enough, the staff in the kitchen, the cooks, came out of the kitchen. Not only did they come out, but they had her books. This happened so many times that I started kidding her, and I said, you must be calling ahead, to tell people, because it's impossible. But in a country like Chile, the impression you've made, where writers are not just public figures, but important figures. Explain.
Well, in Chile, we have two Nobel Prizes, both of them for poetry, and both of them come from the working class. Gabriela Mistral, who was a teacher, a rural teacher, and Pablo Neruda, who was the son of a worker in the railways in the deep, deep south, in Temuco. And they are icons. I mean, writers in Latin America, not only in Chile, are supposed to be visionaries. So you see them often get involved in politics. We have had presidents that were presidents because, not in Chile, but in Uruguay and Paraguay and other places, because they were writers. Mario Vargas Llosa, because he's a writer, was the candidate for the presidency in Peru. So writers are asked about all kinds of questions about life. They are really very respected. And in my case, my books are popular, and they are pirated a lot. So anybody can buy for $2 a book in the street because they're all pirated. And that helps a lot my books. Of course, it doesn't give me any income, but who cares? I mean, it's still wonderful. But I have to tell a little anecdote that happened with Paula, Jeff's wife. We both bonded, absolutely. So we were, in this trip, looking at the landscape. There was nothing to do except volcanoes and lakes. And after you've seen 7 volcanoes, my God, it's like the cathedrals. Who wants to see one more cathedral or one more volcano? So we were just fed up with the volcanoes and the lakes and the forest and the landscape and the beauty of the birds and everything. We just wanted a whiskey and be indoors. But we were far away from a bathroom. So I said, I really need to pee. And Paula says, me too. And so we just stopped the van and we decided to pee on the side of the road. We were wearing pants. So you have to take your pants off like this, and your butt is all exposed. It's not like men. And there we were crouching with our butts out when a bus full of tourists comes and stops right next to us, and everybody was taking pictures. So that's our experience with with the volcanoes in the south.
Right. When I say I know Isabel Allende, I mean I know Isabel Allende.
He knows him well.
I do want to ask you about The Long Petal of the Sea, you know, the most recent novel. And we can't go into that too much in our time, but we've been talking about the nonfiction writing and you gaining your voice. But just to think about this most recent novel, because, and you just mentioned Pablo Neruda, because he's a character. It brings up, it's a historical novel set after the Spanish Civil War. Refugees in Spain go to France and then end up in Chile, and you know, marvelous history of people in different places, but a story of migration, right? A story of statehood and refugees. Very up to the minute in many ways. And I wonder how you were just talking about, especially this tradition of Latin American writers feeling part of history, right, and speaking to it. How do you think about that when you're writing a novel like this last one?
I don't choose what I'm going to write about. It starts growing inside like an uneasiness, almost like a nauseating feeling that I have something there. And it always has to do with something that is in the air. And for a long time now, the anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment has been in the air, not only in the United States, also in Europe and in other places. In Europe, people talk about the immigrant crisis. And that is because for the first time, the migrants, the refugees, are knocking the doors in Europe. Before, there have been masses of refugees and migrants in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in many parts, going from one place to another. The story of displaced people is as old as humanity. And 40 years ago, when I was living in exile in Venezuela, I met a man who had fled from the civil war in Spain in 1938 and had ended up in Chile because Pablo Neruda, the poet, managed to get a boat and put 2,000 people in this boat, refugees from Spain, and send them to Chile. Chile received them with open arms. And these people changed the culture. They were artists, musicians, historians, philosophers, and also workers with particular skills that they could teach to Chilean workers. So they were welcome, and they had a life in Chile for 30 years. Then we had the military coup, and many of these people had to get out again in similar circumstances into a second exile. And that was the case of this man who was called Victor Pey. And I met him in Venezuela, and he told me his story. And I carried the story of Victor Pey in my heart for a long time, but I never found the need to write it until this was in the air, you know, this thing that makes me so uneasy, so itchy in a way. And when I can write about it, and research about it, I can somehow have a vision of how extended it is, how old it is, how global. And then I can handle it better because I understand it better. So my last 3 books have touched on displaced people. In the midst of winter, practically everybody is someone displaced that meets in a story in Brooklyn. And they are all Americans in a way, but they come from another place. The Japanese Lover is the story of a Jewish woman who has escaped the Holocaust and a Japanese man who has been in the internment camps during the Second World War. So every story that I write somehow is connected to the theme of immigrants and, of course, Long Petal of the Sea. Because I myself have experienced that. I was the daughter of diplomats, so I was always changing schools and countries and saying goodbye to people and languages and houses and pets and everything. Then I became a political exile, and I lived in Venezuela for 13 years. And then I became an immigrant in the United States. So I know what it is to never belong in a place, to be always a foreigner.
When we talked about that book at one time, I remember you saying that the characters wrote themselves.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting way of thinking about how one writes fiction.
Especially in this case, because the story happened.
Yeah.
So when you can pick up an event that is a historical event, but recent, and you can still talk to some people who lived it, then it has a life of its own that a historical novel placed 200 years ago never has.
But it relied on a lot of research, which you did.
Well, of course, you have to do the research, but the personal testimony is just so valuable. When I wrote that book that I told you about, Daughter of Fortune, I went to Chile. I didn't want the voices of the 49ers to tell the story because those were the white people that came a year and a half later to the discovery of gold. There were people there panning for gold long before. There were the Mexicans who owned the land to begin with. There were the Native Americans. There were Chinese. And then Peruvians and Chileans came through the Pacific. And I wanted those voices, the voices of the people who were defeated, whose land was taken away, whose minds were taken away. And we think of the gold rush and we think white people. But it wasn't like that at all. That's the history that we learn in 4th grade, but it is not the real story. So I went to Chile and I researched in the public library for the letters that the Chilean miners wrote to their families. And there I found stuff that you never find in a history book, personal testimonies.
You know, I don't know if you all know this, but there's now a TV series based on her life. And I wonder, it's called Isabel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you happy with it, by the way?
Very happy that they spent talent, money, enthusiasm in writing about my life. Of course, I'm honored.
Yeah.
And also the actress that plays me is really gorgeous. She's tall, by the way.
That dramatic license, I guess.
Yeah.
But I did want to, I brought it up in the context of thinking about storytelling today, and especially at a writers' conference like this, in a world where, I mean, because you've been doing this a long time and seen the ways that storytelling has changed in the culture, right? So especially more recent years, the rise of serial television, podcasts, social media now with questions about our attention spans and things like this. Are you impacted by that, or what do you see happening for storytelling?
Storytelling will always be there because it's a human need. As soon as we learned language, we started telling stories. And we need to hear stories to connect to other people, to learn, to feel that we are human. So that will never end, but the form in which it's delivered has changed, of course, and it will keep on changing. I hope that someday we will get a chip implanted in the brain and we won't need to read. We will just close our eyes and we will have the whole book there. That would be great. But the person who writes the book will still be needed. And so today we have a lot of mini-series and series and podcasts and stuff that are other forms of delivering what has already been written by someone. Someone told the story. And that is always going to be, I think, a need.
I know you have questions, and let's go to that. I'll ask you one more question, so get ready here, okay? I guess my last question was along the line, you joke about aging, and you're writing in this book about getting older.
Oh, there's a whole big chapter about aging.
Yes. Buy the book, by the way.
Which is a great thing, by the way. If you are age, the alternative is worse.
But what do you feel is left to, we joke about 75 million books sold and 25. What's left to do?
A lot. I'm not giving up. It's interesting. I feel more alive and more curious and more passionate about the world than ever before. Because before I was sort of distracted, raising kids, trying to make a living, raising grandkids, dealing with husbands and stuff. I know, it sounds as if I had too many, but it's only 3. And now I belong to that group of people who have reached a certain age with health care, who are still lucid and their brains work, who have a community, and who can have purpose. And so I'm delighted to have a foundation that allows me to see the world and be in the world and act in the world. I love writing and researching and being with my characters and my stories. What I don't like that much anymore are most people. So I've become very selective, which I couldn't do before. So now, for example, the people I like, I love being with them. I don't go to cocktail parties because I'm very short, and the shrimp fall on me. And I see only nostrils up there. So I don't do that. But small gatherings where I can discuss things and all that, I'm passionate about all that. And I hope to continue writing for as long as I can have memory and attention. I come from thank you. I come from a line of people who live very long. My mother died at 98, totally lucid and vain, still putting on lipstick. And my stepfather at 102. My grandfather was almost 100. And they don't lose their minds, which is important.
Yeah. All right. We're grateful you chose to spend time with us.
Thank you.
Okay, let's
Thank you.
We have 10 minutes, so if we can get in as many questions as we want, okay, right there, yes.
So thank you for the conversation. Could you share a little bit more about the circumstances of your exile? Where were you in your career at that point, and how urgent was it for you to either decide to leave, and how were you welcomed in Venezuela?
Well, we elected a socialist president that represented a coalition of parties of the center and the left in 1970. That was Salvador Allende. And he, in Chile, the president lasts for the administration for 6 years. Immediately after he was elected, the forces of the right, helped by the CIA, this was the time of the Cold War, tried to topple the government in any possible way. First there was economic sabotage, then there was, a lot of things that is not the case now to analyze. But we had then a military coup propped up by the right wing and by the CIA. And it was, in 24 hours the country changed. We had the longest and strongest democracy in the continent. And in a matter of hours, everything was dismantled. I'm telling you that this can happen anywhere, by the way. Yeah? Congress was eliminated, the judiciary system was not independent anymore, no free press, no right to gather more than 6 people without a permit. People could be arrested. There was no habeas corpus, which means that they could be arrested indefinitely. People disappeared and their bodies were never found to this day. Many people were just killed in the streets. So a time of brutal repression started, which was welcomed by part of the population that supported the coup, the right wing and the parties of the right wing. The people from the left, the people who had supported Allende, lived in fear, and many of them perished, and others had to get out. So there was a massive exodus of people that left the country. I stayed. The day of the coup, as I said, September 11th, the Mexican government sent a plane to Chile to rescue Allende's family, and I am part of the family. And they took most of the family who was still alive or not in prison to Mexico, where they started a new life. I didn't go because I never thought that a dictatorship could last in Chile. It was unthinkable. I think the only people who really believed that were the military, no one else. And so I thought, no, I'll just do what I have to do and keep quiet. My grandfather was horrified. He said, you go home and stop working, because I was a journalist. And a very outspoken journalist, and I had a TV program, so I was very visible. So I lost all my jobs. I tried to be home, but it doesn't work with me. And I got involved in helping people get out of the country or smuggle information. This is nothing heroic. Thousands of people were doing the same thing, mostly because we didn't know the consequences. If I knew today the consequences of what could have happened, I would have never done it. And, well, of course, there was a moment when the circle of repression closed around my neck, and I had to get out. So I got out first with the idea that I could spend some time, maybe a month, 2 months, I don't know, somewhere, and wait for things to calm down and then come back. But my husband found out that I couldn't go back because I was in a blacklist. So my husband reunited with me in Venezuela. We never quite unpacked because we thought, this is only for some time. 13 years later, I ended up as an immigrant in the United States before we had democracy in Chile. The dictatorship lasted 17 years, and then I went back. Any other questions?
Where did I? No? Oh, way back there, yes. Thought I saw somebody.
You have a good eyesight.
Isabel, muchas gracias por venir a la conferencia. Sus libros me han tenido un impacto increíble en mi vida.
Gracias.
So thank you. I have a question. When you start writing your books and you say you start at the same date, always, when you sit down to write them, are you at a point where your research is done? Especially with historical fiction, do you feel like you have the material that you need and you start creating the story?
Sometimes by January 7th, I don't know what I'm going to write, but I sit down on January 8th no matter what. And I know that if I sit long enough, something will happen. And it usually takes weeks before it shapes up. In the case of a historical novel, however, there's an event and there's a time when it happened. So I already know the event, the time, and the place that I have researched. And the research gives me a lot. People say, do you have people researching for you? Because sometimes the research is massive. And I say, no, because I don't know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the slave revolt in Haiti, but I don't know what I'm looking for. So I start reading and researching, and in the research, things start to appear that are wonderful. In the case of that book about the slave revolt in Haiti, I wasn't planning that book at all. I was going to write about the pirates of the Caribbean. So I went to New Orleans to research the pirates, because there's a fascinating story about pirates and democracy that one day I will tell. And so I was researching that, and I said, why is this town so French? And then I started researching the people who came, the French plantation owners and their families and slaves that came to Louisiana after the revolt in Haiti. And I said, well, what was happening in Haiti? And then I ended up writing about Haiti. So the research leads me to places. When it's not historical fiction, it's much harder, way harder.
All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you
the great
so much.
Isabel Allende.
Gracias. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.